It's a real honour and pleasure to be here at the conference, particularly as it's the 25th year anniversary. I just want to begin by saying I think a big round of applause for Jill and Keitan and everyone for all the work they've done over the years in organising this and all the other organisers. I think it's been fantastic. So we're giving a big round of applause. It's been amazing to be able to come here every year and to meet and to talk to other counselling psychologists. The last keynote I did was back in 2009 at Warwick 10 years ago, and I'd only just qualified as a counselling psychologist, so I was incredibly nervous. I'm not sure it's improved much since then, but it was a real pleasure then to talk about it. And I was also back here in Cardiff in 2013. When we had the conference here. And I just want to give people who are perhaps new to Cardiff just one bit of advice about being here at the conference. And that's if Terry Hanley comes up to you at 2 o'clock in the morning and asks you to go swimming in the River Taff with him, I would advise you to say no. It wasn't a good idea, just looking back. But we did have a lot of fun then, so it was a good time. So for this talk, I am going to be talking about directionality. And I think it's something that's really at the heart of me for what it means to be a counselling psychologist. Something, as I was thinking about this conference, something that I put on Twitter a couple of days ago, which is I really love being a counselling psychologist. I think there's something about the identity and what it means to be a counselling psychologist. I was a psychotherapist and a counsellor, and I've had different identities. But for me, there's something about counselling psychology, about the openness and the passion and the flexibility of our approach that is really unique. And what I love about it is the combination of humanism and then also rigour. And what I'm going to talk about today is a kind of model and a way of understanding human being around this idea of directionality based on some work that I've been doing over the last couple of years and really goes back years and years before that in my thinking, which is really trying to find a way of combining that humanistic essence of counselling psychology, that deep care and respect for the other, with a rigour and with a way of understanding, and particularly with a way of understanding psychological distress. Because I think, and I come from a humanistic existential background, and one of the real challenges for us from that background is this. If you say that people are intelligible and that they're doing the best they can and that they have an actualizing tendency and there's a growth potential, how is it that people can end up just getting so messed up in their lives? Like, if we're actualizing, why isn't everything fine? Why is it that we get messed up? And I guess in many ways that's something I've been struggling with kind of theoretically and in terms of research, trying to understand. And trying as a counselling psychologist to develop an understanding of psychological distress and psychological problems that doesn't get us back into some medical model, doesn't get us into a way of understanding people which says, people get it wrong, people don't understand, people need an expert to guide their life. But at the same time, while we hold the notion of an actualizing tendency, we hold the notion of people's potential, we can also acknowledge that people get really messed up and that people can really struggle in their lives. So I want to talk about how I've kind of come to think about that, and also to think about a model. The other thing I want to talk about is the idea that some of our ideas as counselling psychologists, I think, can really form a basis for a more integrative model in the field. I'm sure you know this story about the blind men and the elephant, that they all feel different parts of an elephant, and one says it's a snake, and one says it's a tree, and one says it's a wall. The one that feels the side thinks it's a wall, and the one that feels the tail says it's a snake. And in some versions of this story, that they end up coming to blows about these different versions of the same thing. And I think in the therapy field, you could say that in some ways there's something quite similar happens, that maybe, our clients and the problems we're dealing with are in some ways one thing. And we all have this, whether it's the person-centered or the psychodynamic or the CBT explanation, that we think that we're describing something very different when actually the elephant in the room, if not to mix metaphors too much, is that actually maybe we're describing a change process and an understanding that has many similarities to it. And what I want to suggest is that counselling psychology, actually, I think we're uniquely placed to answer this question because we are fundamentally integrative. And of all the approaches, we don't align ourselves with one particular understanding, one version of what that elephant actually is. We have a capacity, I think, to stand back as a profession, to respect all the different views, but also to acknowledge that there are different views and not get into that hard line, this is a snake, this is a wall, and end up coming to a fight. Some of the work that you might know that I've done on pluralism was in many ways part of this journey, and really what I'm going to talk about is an ongoing journey from and as very much part of pluralism, because I think in pluralism what we tried to do is we tried to say, come on guys, like, let's stop fighting about this, let's start trying to understand each other and have a dialogue about these different positions and see where we're coming from. But what I'm going to talk about today is a bit more about trying to see how we can actually create a kind of unified understanding of distress and change that can bring these different models together and create more of a common language, a common framework. So what I'm going to talk about is this concept of directionality, and then the idea that directionality can have different phases to it. I'm going to talk about a kind of structural way of understanding directionality, and then how it can explain psychological distress. And then I'm going to talk about it as a common framework for the psychological therapies. And also, very importantly, what I want to talk about is the relationship between psychological and social models of change. Because I think one of the biggest problems, and again, counselling psychology is brilliantly placed to answer this, but one of the biggest problems with a lot of our models, whether it's CBT, psychodynamic, or person-centered indeed, despite its humanistic basis, is that it really doesn't take into account the social and the political causes of distress. You know, we know things like racism, homophobia create massive psychological distress in people. And it's not that our models are against that or deny that, but they don't really conceptualize it. They don't explain how that happens in a way, you know, if you're looking at dysfunctional thinking, then how does that explain the pain that's caused by homophobia? That's not about dysfunctional thinking. That's about very rational understanding of a world that is very threatening. Ben, I hope you don't mind me saying, we were talking last night about, you know, the threat that you experienced walking with your husband down the street. I mean, that's not about some misconception. That's not about some problem with your actualizing tendency. That's about a real world that is fucked, for want of a better word, you know, and is creating problems in distress. And I think as counselling psychologists, we need to understand and think about those processes in a way that links in with our own psychological models of change. Apologies for the bad language. That's not in my script. But I do feel, you know, I feel very passionately about that. So I want to talk about this idea of directionality and directions. What does directionality mean? It's a word that I was struggling with and trying to find for a long time. And it's something about trying to capture that essence of what it means to be a human being. So it's really an ontological concept. Buber describes a direction as that primal tension of a human soul which moves it to choose and realise this and no other of the infinity of possibilities. So direction is like kind of motivation, intention. The model that I'm going to present starts from the idea that we are fundamentally agentic, and I think that's right at the heart of counselling psychology. You know, that in the humanistic model, we say that people aren't sponges, we're not blank sheets, that we have a directionality, we have an agency to us. You know, that human beings are intentional. We aim at goals, we're aware that we cause future events, and we seek meaning, value, and creativity. That's from the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, the description of what humanistic psychology stands for. And I think in many ways, as counselling psychologists, we stand for something similar. We stand for this idea that the clients we work with aren't machines, they're not stimulus response black boxes, they're not cognitive computers, they're not rats, that the people that we work with are first and foremost human beings, and that we start from that premise as these humanistic and existential approaches do. And as I argued in my paper about welcoming the other, that is the essence of the counselling psychology stance is to care about and to relate to people in that way. So when we talk about directionality, we're talking about the idea that people are moving towards the future. And the theme of our conference is tomorrow's mysteries today. That our being is a being towards the future. It's a stretching out towards the future. Of course, our past is enormously influential on who we are and how we are. But we're not just about the past or even the present. We're also moving forward. We when we think about coming to this conference, it's not just caused by something. It's about who we want to be, who we want to become, what we want to learn, where we want to go. And it's about the choices that we make in terms of moving forward. So directionality means that we are always on the way to somewhere. And it means that we're agentic. It means that we are trying to make something happen. We're not just victims and recipients of our circumstances. And it also means, I think, and Lang has this lovely word, intelligibility. And really that's at the heart of all our psychotherapies, all our psychologies, is that we do things for a reason. When we work with our clients, borderline personality, depression, anxiety, you might work with a client, for instance, who's not going out. But as counselling psychologists, coming from that understanding of people as agentic, as intelligible, as directional, when we work with that person who doesn't want to leave their room, we're not thinking what's wrong with them. We're not trying to kind of pathologize them, although we might understand the distress it causes them. What we also deeply want to understand is the intelligibility, the part of them, the sense, the meaning, the part of them that is so scared, for instance, of going outside of that room, that it is just too terrifying. And that is how that they are protecting themselves. Maybe this is a client who's been abused, who's been traumatized, and that to go out of that room and to leave their house feels like the most enormous threat. And without trying to ignore the distress it causes them, as counselling psychologists, we try and understand the directionality behind it. And what I should say is that when I'm talking about directionality, this framework, in many ways what I'm trying to do is bring together ways of understanding that we already have and to try and find the essence of it rather than kind of radically new understanding. One of the ways that I think about directionality is as a kind of a delta of a river, because it's not just, of course, that we have one direction that we're going in one way. We have multiple directions, like these strands, these different streams of a river that move out in our lives. And we can think about our lives, obviously there's the Taoist metaphor of being as a river. But really, it's not just one river, it's multiple rivers. And then we have the question, of course, of how the different parts of the river interact. And sometimes they're very flowing and gentle, and that there's a calmness between these different strands, these different rivers in our life, as they kind of move out and we move forward in the world. But of course, sometimes it's much more turbulent, and one part of the river is clashing against another part of the river, that it's choppy, that there's rapids, that things are in chaos and conflict. And what I want to suggest as I go on is that one way of understanding distress in directional terms, in terms of agency, is that it's not that somebody's doing something wrong, but the problem is that in doing one thing that we want, in following one direction, we often run up against other directions, and our directions come into conflict, and that's where we end up having problems. Something else about the concept of directionality, and this is really important for me. One of the things we talked about when we looked at pluralism, and when John McLeod and I and lots of other colleagues, and Melody's been involved in this, developed the concept of pluralism, one of the things we really emphasised was goals. And the reason we emphasise goals is because we wanted to say that psychological therapy should be oriented towards what clients most deeply want. It shouldn't be about symptoms, it shouldn't be about medicalisation per se as the targets of therapy. Therapy should be aligned with what service users want to do, and that's about their goals. And then from their goals we find methods. But one of the things we found is that a lot of psychologists, counselling psychotherapists really don't like the term goals. It really turns people off. And I think one of the reasons for that is because there's something about it that is very ends orientated. It's kind of like about the outcome. It's about where you get to. And there's a kind of mechanistic, kind of almost entrepreneurial business enterprise sense about, you have goals and you fight towards your goals and you get towards your goals. And I think as counselling psychologists, we know that there's often more important, subtle processes that go on. If I think about my client who's scared to leave their room, then that's not, you wouldn't say it's a goal for them not to leave their room. I mean, it's kind of a goal, but it's not kind of quite the right word. But when we talk about directions, we're talking about both those conscious goals, and I'll explain this a bit more in a minute, but we're talking about both those conscious goals. But we're also talking about something that is much more subtle and unconscious. We're talking about just those subtle yearnings we might have, those feelings, those desires, very much from a psychoanalytic frame, for instance, those hopes, those tinges that are also there that we may well not be aware of. And also we're talking about something both cognitive and embodied. And for instance, in the world of focusing, there's a lot of work around embodied directionality in terms of the directions of the body. And the focusing in the person-centered field will encourage the client to connect with and recognise those directions, that slight tension in the stomach that might emerge and reveal itself as a desire for fullness, or a desire for being fed or for being cared for. So we're talking about both those things when we talk about directions. And also, very importantly, directions are not just within us, but they're in the world. In phenomenology, intentionality, we talk about being in the world. Directions are in the world. They're a relationship to the world. You can't have a direction. If I have a direction towards loving my kids, that doesn't just exist within me. It's towards my kids. If I have a direction towards some food, that's towards the food. And that's really important, because if we think about well-being essentially as the actualization of our directions, the capacity for people to actualize their directions, then part of that is about what their directions are and about whether they're realistic perhaps and whether they can achieve them. But critically, part of it is also about the world that they live in. And that someone, asylum seeker may come here, they may have a direction for safety and to feel safe in their world. But if they live in a housing estate where there's racism and prejudice and violence towards them, that direction cannot be actualised. And that's not because of them, it's because of the world that they're encountering. And I'll come back to that later. One of the interesting things that existentialists and many other psychologists have done, using terms like motivation or similar to direction, is to think about different phases of it and the way that our directionality unfolds. It's not just one thing. Motivation is not one thing. So we've got things like the very well-known stages of change model that talk about some fascinating things around direction. We've got the Gestalt cycle. There's a very interesting model called the Rubicon model that talks about the differences between goals and desires. Is another kind of model which breaks it down. And what I've been talking about and what I write about in my book is something called a directional arc that I think can help us understand both some of these different concepts, but also begin to understand and map out how the different therapies relate to each other. So while I was doing this, I was, as I was kind of preparing this talk and thinking about this, I was watching Fleabag. Has everyone seen Fleabag? Yeah, which is this amazingly kind of environment show about a woman, and I don't know how you describe it, slightly chaotic, I guess. Very charming, but slightly chaotic. And in one of the, in the second series, actually, I'll be careful about spoilers here, because I'm assuming not everyone's seen it. If you haven't seen it, you must see it. It's on BBC 3. And she falls in love, I think it's okay, she falls in love with a priest. And there's various interesting things that emerge from falling in love with a priest. And so what happens, so with that direction, or with any direction, we can think about it as begins with an emergence. Something happens. She's at the dinner with her parents, and she sees this priest. And there's a desire that it wasn't actually just for Fleabag. I was watching it with my teenage daughters. And they were seeing this priest, he's Andrew Scott. And they were like, oh, he's gorgeous. I had to sit through that for the whole second series. But yeah, so there's this desire that emerged. And of course, at the beginning, it may not be conscious. She wasn't really aware of it. And then it's only often when these desires emerge, there's an awareness that comes later. And of course, all these different phases may or may not be there. They may get skipped. But again, if we think about actualization and direction as a generally good thing, then probably all these phases are important to some extent. So there's an awareness. She's talking to her sister and she thinks, God, actually that priest, he was really hot, wasn't he? And the sister's going, yeah, he was really hot. And then there's a kind of evaluation phase. And this is not so much my own ideas, but bringing together lots of these different models that often say something very similar. There's an evaluation like, Jesus, I'm in love with a priest. I fancy a priest. I want to have sex with a priest. Is that a good thing? And, there's an evaluation phase we go through as we start to become aware of these directions, thinking, is this something we want to actualize or not? And then there's intention. A decision to make it happen. And in the Rubicon model, this is the kind of crossing of the Rubicon, when we go from having these desires and these hopes and these expectations and fantasies and everything, and then we actually say, right, I'm going to put this into action. So then there's a planning. I think she ends up, she goes along to a church fete so that she can meet him. She turns up at his apartment. All these things that I think she takes confessional at one point so that she can spend a bit of time with him. There's like, how are we going to make these things happen that we want to have happen? Action. Of course, then I won't go into the action that happens between them. I think that definitely would be a spoiler. And while action, there's also feedback. Does she fancy him? Does she like him? Is there something coming back? And then there's the termination phase. And as I say, most of these phase models talk about these different phases. This is just kind of pulling it all together. But it's a really nice way of thinking about it for a number of reasons. One is that it starts to explain how these different directional concepts fit together. And I think particularly it explains why the concept of goals in many ways is pretty limited. Goals is great once we've got an intention, but goals is about, we intend to do something, and then we have a goal, or we have a project, or we have a particular striving, and we can put it into action. But the problem with goals, per se, is that it doesn't really address all this stuff that goes on here, that kind of psychoanalytic, that cauldron of seething desire that Freud talks about. That's not about goals. The Oedipal complex, nobody says, well, my goal is to have sex with my mother. That is something that happens at a very deep unconscious level. So when we look at this, what we're talking about earlier on in terms of emergence and awareness and evaluation, to some extent, although particularly emergence, is more about our desires, about our wants. And therefore, when we want to think about the person holistically, I think it's true to say that we can't just think about the person's goals. We also need to think about what, at a more unconscious mixed level, is around the things that they desire and the things that they want. The other nice thing about this model, when we start laying it out this way, is we can begin to see how these different therapeutic approaches actually are. It's not that they're, CBT is the opposite of psychodynamic or that person-centered, that they're radically different. The reason that they're different is that they often approach or work at different phases of this directional arc. So if you look at, for instance, the psychodynamic approaches, they particularly focus on the emergence of desire, understanding desire, projection, and really trying to get to those unconscious desires that people have and to make more sense of them. And in many ways, the humanistic approaches are the same, that they work with those, the deep-seated organismic valuing potential, the tendencies within the person. What does the person really most deeply want? What is it that they're trying to get to? That we work from a humanistic standpoint. We're trying to understand that. It's not that we don't work. It's not that if a client says, I want to do some planning and I want to put things into action. It's not that we disavow that and we say, no, you're not allowed to do that here. You're going to have to go off to behaviour therapy to do that. But it's not really the focus of our work so much. We kind of assume that if we can work with awareness and evaluation, then the person will get on with it and do the action and planning that they need. But then you have other approaches, like the existential approach, which is very interesting because it really focuses on intention. What are you going to do at this point now? What choices are you going to make? And in many ways, the existential approach starts with intention. It says, right, okay, what choices do you make in this situation? And would hold that that is the key point. And then we have the approaches like the cognitive behavioural and the behavioural approaches that do work much more with planning and with action and with using feedback and even with thinking about termination and when we end things. And again, they're less perhaps interested in the emergence of desires. There's maybe more assumptions on what those desires are. But they don't deny that. They don't say that, people shouldn't work at those levels. It's just that the focus becomes more on how you plan things, maybe weighing things up, how you evaluate it, maybe what you plan to do and thinking strategically about your plans. Behavioural approach is behavioural activation, actually kind of scheduling what you're going to do, putting it into action. So when you look at it that way, you can actually see that in many ways the therapies are very aligned. There's no harm in perhaps working in a very psychodynamic way to help somebody understand what it is that they deeply want, giving them lots of space that they can think about it. But then maybe later on in the work, working in a more focused way where you're thinking about the plans, where you're putting things into action, where you're testing things out. But these different therapies, if you're skilled in them, can work together. They don't have to be opposed to each other. It's also quite interesting, this model, if you think about with yourselves or with your clients, what are your areas of strength and limitations? So, for instance, are you someone who's good at evaluating things? Do you tend to spend too much time in planning? Are you someone who goes straight to action? I know for myself, most of the problems in my life have happened because I just get really bored with evaluation and planning. I think I just can't be bothered with it. So for instance, for myself, like if I'm going off on a holiday, I would rather just buy a ticket. I get kind of like, I've got to do something. So I go and I buy a ticket and I go straight to action. I don't really think about it. I don't really plan it or where I'm going to be. And then I find myself somewhere. If I'm lucky, it's a good place. If I'm unlucky, is in some awful place somewhere thinking about what I do. But for that tends to be my characteristic style. You might want to think about what is your characteristic style. Or with your clients, is there something that gets missed out on that? Is it that they really don't do the planning? Or that they're always planning, constantly planning, thinking about planning, but then never put anything actually into action? So that's one way of thinking about directions. But again, it tends to be thinking about it in quite a kind of linear way and just focusing on one direction at a time. And there's another way of thinking about it, which is more, kind of turns it, and I would have done this in PowerPoint, but I couldn't work out the transition, but it kind of turns it 90 degrees onto its head and thinks about directions in a more hierarchical model with higher order directions and then kind of lower order directions. Because and this is, again, people like Bill Powers and Warren Mansell at Manchester, one of Terry's colleagues, has done a lot of work around this. This idea that we can think about, the things that we most fundamentally want, and then we can work down to the ways that we go about getting that. So kind of as we go down, we get to the how we do things. And as we go up, we talk about why we do things. So, we might say, for instance, that someone's highest order direction is for relatedness, but what they most deeply want is to feel that closeness and warmth in their life with other people. And then we might think, well, how do they do that? And there might be different ways of doing it. There might be close romantic relationships. Might be one way of getting that relatedness. Time with family, spending time with their family might be another way of doing it. I think that's supposed to be casual sex, actually, rather than causal sex. Causal sex would be an interesting, I'm not quite sure what that would be, anyway. So they might use different ways of doing that. And then to do that, again, to have a close romantic relationship, it might be things like, going on a date, contacting an ex, and then, how do you go on a date where you have to pick up a phone, and how do you pick up a phone? You have to dial the numbers. So you get these kind of very, but each of those we can think about as kind of cycles, and Powers and other people have talked about these kind of output test exit cycles where we kind of set a goal and we try and do it, we see how far away we are, we keep on going around until we've done it. And he has this very complex model of these kind of 11 levels of cycles. But essentially we can think that there are these lower order directions that allow us to achieve these higher order directions. And it raises the interesting question then of what is it that people at the highest level most fundamentally want? And, so our different models have different views on that. So Some, for instance, the psychodynamic model, and to some extent the CBT model, have pleasure or happiness as the highest order direction that we all really want. The humanistic models is more about growth, the existential model is more about meaning perhaps. Self-determination theory, brilliant theory. If you haven't come across self-determination theory from a humanistic counselling psychology perspective, do look at it, Decky and Ryan, because it's so informative and such a well-evidenced approach for humanistic psychology. But they talk about autonomy, competence, and relatedness as the three most higher order directions. And again, if you look at all the different theories on this, and that's one of the things I did for my book, then that comes up again and again and again. Autonomy, competence, related. I have to say that's not particularly competent, having competence over 2 lines. I'll have to work on that on the slide. Safety, I think safety is another critical one. I mean, Maslow talks about this more than anyone else really, but if you look at, thinking about that client who can't go out of her room or doesn't want to go out of her room, what's her direction now? I think safety, and many of the clients we work with around particularly anxiety, a lot of it comes down to that deep desire for safety and how that gets in the way of other things. So there's lots of different ways of thinking about what these highest order desires are. But I think, we can argue about it and we can say, do people most fundamentally need meaning or pleasure? But at the end of the day, as psychologists, as any psychologist, if a client comes to us and says something like, what is most important for me in my life is spiritual awakening, we're not going to say to them, well, you think that, but really it's about pleasure or it's about competence or autonomy. There's something about, and Isaiah Berlin says this, which I think is really important. He says, there's something about, in a democratic culture, we allow people to have their own highest order desires. We don't define for them what it is that people most fundamentally want. And if we come from that position, then there's no point, in a sense, arguing over which of these is fundamentally the most important. If you read Frankl will say it's not Adler was wrong that it was power and Freud was wrong it's about pleasure, it's about meaning. But I don't think we need to have those arguments, because ultimately, and particularly from a pluralistic standpoint, what we're trying to do is to respect and align ourselves with where our clients are coming from. What that also means in terms of those highest order directions is, when we're talking about what is well-being, we're not talking about things like the capacity to actualise, contact an ex per se. It's not about actualising those directions that is the important bit. What is a well-lived life, a satisfying life, is one where we're able to actualise those highest order directions. So it's one where we're able to have the relatedness that we want, or we're able to have the self-worth that we want, or the pleasure that we want, or it's probably all of those really, maybe it differs for different people, but it's about that capacity to experience those things that we most fundamentally want in our life. And not just about having them, often it's the journey towards them, it's that progress, it's that feeling that we can move towards them. That is the really important bit. And there's good research that shows that well-being is not just associated with meeting your goals, that progress towards goals, knowing what we want in life, probably also to some extent just acknowledging when we have achieved our goals is really important part of it as well. So that raises the question though of why is it then that people do get so messed up? Why is it that, if we have these highest order directions, these lowest order ways of getting to these higher order directions, why is it that people often don't actualise their directions? Why is it that people can really struggle and experience distress? Because they're frustrated and they're not getting the things they want in their life and they feel that they're not moving forward. And again, if you distill what many of our different models talk about, I think there's 2 fundamental processes that they all refer to. So one of them is that often the problem is that our directions are in conflict. And, this idea is, I think, at the core of many of our different models. So, somebody might want relatedness. I got it right. No, I didn't get it right this time. They want relatedness, but they want, how do they get relatedness? Well, they might try and do it through having a close romantic relationship, but they might also try and do it through having casual sex with people. And actually the problem is that, they come to therapy because the problem is that, they're desperate for this romantic relationship, that they can be really close to someone, but something keeps on pulling them away from that, and that's something about they've got this direction towards casual sex, which might be about relating it might be about something else, might be about safety, might be about pleasure, but essentially their directions are pulling in different directions, and that makes it really difficult for the person to get to where they want to be. Or it might be, and I think in many often the case, that it's not the same highest order direction, but people have different highest order directions. And in trying to get to those highest order directions, they end up doing one thing that messes something else up. And this is, I think, one of the most consistent ones we experience as therapists, where you have a client who wants closeness. They really want relatedness in their lives. You know, I've worked with clients who've talked about just the terrible isolation and loneliness and aloneness of being for them. And you think, well, okay, well, what's stopping them? And from this directional perspective, from an understanding of intelligibility, it's not that there's something external that's making them that way. What's happening is that there's a part of them, a side of them, that is stopping them from going into those relationships, and often for very good reasons. You know, if somebody has been, for instance, very traumatized and abused in their past, as we often work with, then if they want to experience safety, they may feel that the only way that they can be safe is to keep others at an emotional distance. So you have a client who's thinking, you know, I've got to be safe in my life. I really want to be safe, and I need to keep people at a distance. But also, I really want relatedness and I want closeness. And you have a situation, for instance, I love this series of cartoons where, you know, you see this person here who someone comes close to them, and their first thought is, oh my God, somebody's trying to get close to me. It's going to really hurt. It's going to be really painful. So they build up a wall higher and higher, and the person is trying more and more to reach out to them. And then at some point, the other person gives up and eventually goes away. And then that desire for relatedness is, hey, where is everyone? You know, so directions can be in conflict sometimes at the same time. And sometimes I think also what happens is that you have different directions that take over at different points in time. In the goals literature, they talk about unconscious goals, and we can also talk about rogue goals, and the ways that sometimes people get taken over by different directions, different goals that become so kind of compulsive, obsessive, that they undermine everything else the person wants. You know, in Fleabag, there's that, like, you know, she has this chaos in her life. And one of the things she wants to do so much to get rid of the chaos is she just kind of throws herself into things like having sex with this awful lawyer she has sex with, as a way of kind of just drowning out the chaos. And of course we have clients who are on drugs and alcohol for very similar reasons. And we can understand, again, the intelligibility of that. We can understand that someone thinks, you know, I just can't bear, you know, I know for myself when I've been feeling really awful, I just think, God, I've just got to have a drink. I just want to have a drink and just blitz everything out. And I kind of know at some level that that's going to make me feel terrible in the morning and might have problems here and here and here, and might not help for my relationship. But goals take us over at different times. John Bargh, who writes a lot about this, says that, you know, we think that we have goals, but actually the goals have us, and that they're autonomous units that can go and do their own thing, and that often they are working against each other. And I see that again and again and again in clients, like this client I was describing before, who you know, has so much of a life, amazing creativity that she has in her life, and yet there is a side of her that is so scared of being out in the world, takes over. It's a rogue goal that ends up destroying everything else she needs. So I think that's one reason in a lot of our models why people don't achieve and why people experience distress. And then I think the second one is that sometimes we're just not very good at knowing how to get what we want. You know, that somebody might want relatedness. Young guy might want relatedness, and you know, if relatedness is how he gets on with all his mates, the way that he gets relatedness with his mates. Sorry, I don't know why it's back to sex again. This is terrible, isn't it? But you know, that if he thinks that you know, that he might think that the way for relatedness is you know, by being really jokey, for instance. And so he's really jokey, and he meets a young woman, for instance, and he's really jokey with her and kind of teasing her and making fun of her. And actually, that's not what that young woman wants. That's not going to attract her to him. She just thinks he's an arsehole. Or, someone thinks that the way to relatedness is casual sex. Maybe they've been watching too much Love Island, as again my teenage daughters have been doing, and think that's the way. We learn things in our world that mean that we don't always know how to get to what we want. And I think for me, this is also really important coming from a person-centered background, because we have a lot of arguments in the person-centered field about the actualizing tendency. What does it mean? And I think one way, and if we have an actualizing tendency, as I said before, why do we mess up? And I think one way of understanding it is that when we talk about the actualizing tendency, we're talking about at the highest order levels, only we know what it is that we most fundamentally want. Nobody can tell me, Ben can't tell me that I need faith when actually I want relatedness. I know that best for ourselves, and our clients know best for ourselves what it is that we want. But when we go down in terms of the ways that we try and achieve those things, then actually there is a lot that we can learn. And that's why things like psychoeducation, behavioural skills training can be massively important, because they can teach us the skills to achieve those goals that we want, and that we don't necessarily have deep inside of us. So and I think that helps understand it, explain that a lot. So I think as human beings, we strive to do our best. That's our kind of counselling psychology motto, if you like. And I think fundamental to our approach, that as human beings, we strive to do our best. But doing our best isn't always the best thing that we could be doing. There's always things that we could learn from different approaches. So I've got about 10 minutes left, and I just wanted to talk through the different psychological models and say about how they might fit into this kind of understanding. Because I think all therapies fundamentally strive to help clients actualize their highest order direction. What I've described, although maybe the terminology, talking about directions and structural frameworks and phases, is kind of a bit unusual and a bit different. Really what I'm trying to do, as I said, is not to create a new framework, but to think about actually how do all our therapies fit together, so that we can think about, well, actually I could use psychodynamic methods here and behavioural methods here, and actually that they're not in conflict, they're actually doing similar things, but just maybe focusing on different parts. And I think what they all do is try and look at that conflict and help people work out things in more synergetic ways. I love this term synergy. So that rather than doing one thing that pulls against something else, you're doing one thing and actually the other thing that you're doing is aligned with it. That you're enjoying sex, for instance, in a way that helps build relationships, or you're building up your self-esteem, which helps you get closer to other people and find meaning, that all these things can come together. So if we think about psychodynamic therapy, clearly a kind of conflict model, there's a conflict between that kind of cauldron of seething desires in the id, and then the part of the person that is much more in control and wants to mediate that in relationship to the real world. And what you do in the psychodynamic methods is that there's a particular focus on developing an awareness of these emerging directions and really recognizing at a very deep level what these directions are, that what matters to us, and being able to evaluate them, using techniques like free association to allow those directions to emerge. Focusing on the past, helping someone look at the kind of chronically ineffective ways that they've been going about doing things, so that then they can think about finding better ways of doing things. I think one of the most succinct definitions of therapy is about helping clients find better ways of doing things. Finding better ways of doing things is throughout our approaches are what it is that we're really trying to do. And in the psychodynamic, we do that by helping them think about their past or their here and now relationship and what's not working. Using interpretation to really get to what those kind of desires are, looking at things like resistance to understand that kind of conflict between someone's desire for change, but also what's holding them back. And I think often that's the desire for safety. And we can use this model then also to think about the contributions of each of these different approaches. As with the pluralistic approach, of really deeply valuing what everybody has to offer. And what's brilliant about the psychodynamic approaches is that they really help us appreciate the unconscious, hidden nature of many of these desires, that it can't always be spelled out as this is goal number 1, goal number 2, goal number 3. That often desires are intangible, are inexpressible, are bodily, and yet are very, very real. That although we might think about directions as sometimes pulling against each other, what psychodynamic therapies teach us is sometimes they're at warfare. Sometimes there's one direction that is deliberately desperately trying to suppress and control another direction. They contribute to an understanding of the importance of awareness as a means towards more synergy and effective, and also around the therapist neutrality, so really allowing all those directions to come to light. And then we can think about the humanistic therapies, and at the top of the humanistic tree is this idea of actualization and potential. And there's a similar conflict. In many ways, it's actually not that different, the conflict in the humanistic therapies. This is, Billy Elliott's hierarchy of want. Between, for instance, the humanistic therapies teach us that often the conflict is between the desire for approval and other desires. That we want to be creative, or we want to be close to other people, or we want to feel good about ourselves, but we're constantly pulled to wanting, we're not pulled, we constantly also move towards wanting approval from others. So we have methods in the humanistic approaches like focusing on the emergence and the highest order desires, empathy, resonating with the client's directions, emotion-focused work that can really try and get down into those deepest directions. Because, of course, emotions and directions are always fundamentally interlinked. You can't have an emotion without having a direction behind it. If we didn't care about something or want something, we wouldn't feel things. Our emotions are always about our directions. Focusing, as I was saying before, helps us connect with embodied directions. Things like two-chair work in Gestalt therapy and emotion-focused therapy that help us actually put the directions on different chairs so that they can talk to each other and find ways forward and find synergetic solutions to moving forward in someone's life. So humanistic therapies also have a lot of contributions, understanding the intrinsic versus extrinsic split, a natural belief in our ability to develop more effective and synergetic configurations, emotions and the importance of emotions, and methods for facilitating interpersonal and intrapersonal dialogue. And then we have the existential therapies. And what's fascinating about the existential therapies, we're a cheerful bunch as existential therapists, because one of the things we suggest is actually, when it comes down to it, there's nothing there at the top. You'd like to think that there's self-actualization or relatedness, but, and you can say that, but at the end of the day, it's all constructs. There's nothing there. As I say, we're a cheerful bunch. I like this cartoon, Existential Night Out. Tonight, Leonard Cohen sings the songs of Morrissey. Although I don't think anybody would want to sing Morrissey songs at this point in time, given what he's been up to. And then there's other existential therapies that say that actually meaning's at the top. Frankl, very different branch of existential therapy. And actually all the things that we do are about trying to find meaning and purpose in our life. So in the existential approaches, we particularly focus on intentions and meanings and choices. And we use meaning-oriented practices to help clients find what those highest order meanings and purposes are. And I think, again, the existential field has many really valuable contributions that sit alongside these different models. For instance, this idea that one of the fundamental challenges is to face this idea that there is no given highest order directions, or that meaning is a highest order direction itself. Also, Emmy van Derzen has written a lot about this, that, if we think about well-being as actualization of directions, that's partly about what we do, but it's also about what our expectations are. And if we have very high expectations, then we're much less likely to fulfill our directions. And if we have high expectations, for instance, to be happy in our life, then that can cause real problems. Also, in existential approaches, as with other approaches like ACT, that they talk about the way that our highest order directions aren't necessarily just physical ones. They might also be values. And I think that's fundamentally true. We can see people who put faith as their highest order direction, or communism, or a religion, that these things can be enormously important in people's lives and things that we should be working with. Also, the existentialists talk about the way that often directions can be fundamentally in conflict, and perhaps there's not always things that we can do that, and working the intent phase. And then finally, we have the cognitive behavioural therapies, which I've talked a bit about already. And although, maybe conflict's less obvious in those therapies, in fact, there is a real, the heart of the cognitive behavioural therapies is a notion of conflict. And it's particularly a conflict between how we end up doing things in the short term, like black and white thinking, dichotomizing, all or nothing thinking, that do have a short-term payoff in that they make it easier for us to just think, but have a lot of long-term problems because of rather than thinking kind of more rationally. And also, as I was saying before, what you see in the behavioural therapies is a lot about ineffective ways of doing something. That somebody might have a highest order direction for safety. They want to do that by reducing their anxiety. But the way that they reduce their anxiety then is by checking their front door every 5 minutes. Because understandably, they think that, if I know that my door is closed, then my anxiety is going to go away. And of course, we know the problem is that just the anxiety comes up. So that in the behavioural therapies, there's helping people to learn better ways of moving towards the things that they want. So in the cognitive behavioural methods, there's a focus on evaluation and planning, short-termist, overcoming short-term thinking, problem-focused methods, acquiring more effective means like psychoeducation, and lots of different very, very valuable contributions in terms of helping us find more effective ways of doing the things that we want. So in all these different therapies, that there are theories and methods from these different approaches can really be combined. As counselling psychologists, we can use them all because they are aligned. There's differences, but fundamentally they are all aligned ways of helping people actualise their different directions. Just the thing I must say is a little bit about social justice and social change, because as I was saying before, our capacity to actualise our directions is not just about our internal world and how we do things internally. It's also about the external world. And we may face, or our clients may face, an external world that is very restrictive, that doesn't allow them to actualise these directions, whereas others may have a much more facilitative external environment. And in fact, every internal conflict, if you think about any internal conflict, whether it's that the person we were looking at before, where they want closeness, but they also want safety and builds up the wall. If that other person was willing to sit with them or climb over that wall, for instance, then they could potentially have both. So the more restrictive our environment, the more that our different directions are forced against each other. Internal conflict, is a product of external circumstances, that they're always fundamentally related. So that means that to comprehensively understand and address psychological distress, we need to consider social as well as psychological factors. And that's one of the real challenges. And as I say, I think as counselling psychologists, we're brilliantly placed to do that. What's also very interesting about this model, and what I've talked about in my book, is that we can then take these ideas of synergy and conflict and effectiveness and also transpose them to higher levels of organisation. Kersler talks about a holarchy and the idea that we can think about the individual and the goals within them, but we can also think about the individual within the family within the community within society. So that we can also think about how communities relate, or how people relate in a dyad. And what I think is the most exciting thing is that actually the principles are very, very similar when we think about what's good at these levels, different levels, and what's problematic. Things like communication, trust. Just as we need to kind of trust ourselves to be able to move forward, people need to be able to trust each other to be able to form synergies. Communities need to be able to trust each other. They need to communicate. We need equality. We need an appreciation of diversity. And when we think about principles like appreciation and diversity, it's not just at the inter-community level, but actually that also reaches back down into the intrapersonal level, that we need to also appreciate our own diversity and our own otherness as a marker of psychological well-being. So I think there's some really exciting developmental work to be done about identifying these common principles of change at all of these different levels. So just very finally, the directional framework that I've been talking about is a kind of distillation, a kind of way of bringing together lots of different models. And I think it's a means for counselling psychologists ourselves to lead the way that I think in many ways we're already doing, in drawing together a wide range of therapeutic, socio-political understandings and methods into a coherent framework underpinned by our fundamental humanistic values. And I think it's a vision of both psychological and social well-being and a capacity for all of us to actualise these highest order directions for relatedness, self-esteem, meaning, these mysteries of tomorrow that we're all striving for, the possibilities of tomorrow that we're all striving for, that we and our clients can experience today. So thank you very much.